Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad that you could join us today. I'm Maren. I'll be your host for this webinar. Make sure that your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide a smooth webinar. During the presentation, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. And you're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our upcoming webinars are will be on next Thursday. That'll be with Catherine Grant. She'll be giving a presentation on Family Search's gallery feature for memories. And then we'll be taking our holiday break, and then we'll return to the webinars on the 9th. And we'll hear from Susan Hoffman, and she'll be talking about naturalization. And there will be an updated calendar for January by the end of this month, so you can look forward to that. And I think that's all that we have for announcements. We will be having a schedule change in the new year. I believe that the schedule will be changing to Wednesday. We will send you updates via the email newsletter about that, as well as posting on our social media channels to let you know when and where you can access webinars in the new year. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, you can visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to the recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we're pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on how to take better photos for genealogy. If you give me just a moment, we can set up that presentation and we'll get things started.
Great. Well, glad to be here again for another of the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. And we would remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and posted to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel on youtube.com. We now have about 472 is the last number I looked at, videos up there. And of course, we'll keep producing them as we go along during the new year. Today, we're going to be talking about how to take better photos for genealogy. Something that perhaps you would like to know a little bit about. Of course, we're not trying to turn genealogists into professional photographers, although we would like to turn the professional photographers into genealogists, but that's kind of a different issue, and I'm not to that today. But we're going to move on here, and kind of the understatement of the beginning of this presentation is the technology has changed photography. It's changed just about everything else in life. It seems like that there's always some technological aspect to almost everything we do. So we do have some old cameras here with the bellows type focusing with that you moved in and out, the lens in and out to focus on the film at the back of that camera. And then we're going to show a new Canon digital camera. So that's sort of the jump from one type of camera to another. And the technology here is revolutionary in the sense that these cameras do not even have the same basic functions. The only really thing they have in common is a lens and a way to open and shut the light from coming to the light sensitive media. In this case, on an old camera, of course, film, and in a new camera, it would be a sensor, an electronic sensor that detects the light. So we have quite a range, and I would say even if you took this Canon camera that you see in the photo here, that it would be a lot of things would have changed on that type of camera, that there's newer ones than the one that's shown in this photograph. To remind people a little bit that the camera is a tool. It has a function, and it is a very specifically and in a lot of cases a very sophisticated tool, and it does require you to have some knowledge about how to use that tool. So we have a picture of some old tools here in the viewpoint, and I would guess that some of us would have difficulty in identifying how or why you would be using some of those tools. Some of them are very obvious, like the saw that's there on the wall. But some of the other tools perhaps are a little bit less familiar and have passed on to very, very specialized usage today by people who actually use the old tools for a variety of purposes other than just collecting them. Now, we need to understand, first of all, that we're not here trying to say that you have to buy into photography in any sense of the word. It's very obvious that there are people out there who become enamored with the technology or enamored with the cameras and spend many, many thousands of dollars on equipment. And they also like to help people think that all of that equipment is absolutely necessary. In other words, they could not do their job if they weren't using this high, very expensive camera or the very expensive equipment. And camera and becoming involved in photography is just an ideal, if you want to call it hobby or persuasion or even profession, for people who love the gadgets and love to accumulate a lot of equipment. Basically, you could there is no limit to the amount of money that you could spend on photography. They even come out with special edition cameras that are made out of gold, that are gold plated, that cost into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they actually sell to people. So by the way, they can take no better photo than many cameras costing just a few dollars. So you can take a perfectly adequate photos with a camera costing less than $500. The $500 is an arbitrary figure, and you can go much less than that and still have a very adequate photo camera. Especially if you're, for instance, not interested in being a photographer, not interested in selling photos professionally, then as a genealogist, basically all you want is a camera that will adequately reproduce the things that you need to have reproduced by taking pictures. That is your relatives taking photos of people and perhaps documents and or artifacts, historical memorabilia that you need to have to flesh out the histories of your ancestors. Perhaps you take pictures of the old homestead, the farm, cemeteries, photos. There's lots of ways that photography comes into play when we start doing genealogy, but none of that needs to be overly expensive. Important thing to understand here is that, and I'll come back to some equipment here in a little bit, but right now we're going to start talking about some basics. The technology really hasn't changed the basics of photography. Photography still has some very basic things that we have to be aware of. The first of those is the exposure, and we'll explain what that means, but it's basically having an adequately lighted photo so that you can see the detail and identify what it is that you're trying to take a picture of. And the next one is the focus, and that's very, very important because all of the detail can be lost by a picture that's out of focus. And I'm going to show some examples of these so that we know exactly what we're talking about. The third one is a little more esoteric in a sense because it's really something that depends on the personal feelings and the amount of artistic feeling that you have. And People can take good and bad photos simply by moving a few inches one way or the other. And what we call good photo and what we call a bad photo is highly subjective. And so, but it all falls under the category of composition, and that is how the items are arranged or placed in the plane of a photograph. When you're thinking of taking a photo, you have to think in terms of what it will look like when the scene is placed within the square rectangle of the photo itself, or the rectangular square of the photo. So when you're looking out at a scene, or you're looking at a group of people, or you're arranging people for a more formal photograph, the idea there is to ultimately have some idea of what happens when you click the shutter, and what happens to the arrangement, and what it will look like when it comes out onto the film, whenever it's developed in the sense of either being displayed as a digital photo or developed as a film from a film camera. Okay, so that's what we're thinking about in terms of the arrangement, or the way that the image actually appears as you look at it. And then the last one, and probably one of the most important, is camera movement. You can have everything, the exposure correct, the focus, you can have everything perfectly composed and have it in a very lovely setting or whatever, however you want to do the photo. But then when you move the camera, that's the end of the whole thing. In other words, you don't get a photo that's worth looking at, because it doesn't convey the information that you want to have. Now, there's one way of looking at photography, and that is that photography is a method of expression. In other words, a photograph ends up being a part of the way that the photographer views the world. It's a slice of his or her world view. So in a sense, the photography becomes an art, and it moves from being a technical subject into being an artistic subject. And we have obviously recognized that in our society, because we have galleries and museums and archives that have preserved photographs merely because they were taken by a certain person, or because they showed a certain type of emotion, and were things that were representative of a certain time period. So we'll have very famous photographers going back in time, people that would be names would be recognized among the general community of the people of the world. So there's it can become a very complex subject, but what we're trying to do here with this presentation, what I'm trying to do is bring it down to the level that there's some basic things we need to know, some basic things we need to do when we take a photograph, or when we try to preserve some memory or some document or something. And then those things are the basic things that have to be done. And if we don't do those basic things, whatever we've done is not worth preserving, is not worth keeping, because it's unreadable, or it's out of focus, or it's overexposed or underexposed or whatever. So now we're going to look at this. Now, exposure is the first level, and that is the amount of light that reaches the surface of that is going to record the image. In the case of an old photograph, it would be the film. And film went through a lot of stages. Started out actually with metal plates that we call daguerreotypes, where the chemical, primarily silver halide-based chemicals, were put onto a surface of metal. It went to glass. Then eventually, as other substrates were developed, they used treated paper. They also used celluloid film, all sorts of different kinds of substrates, of things that of which to capture the light. ultimately, the big revolution was when we switched from using a physical media for recording the light to a media, electronic media made up of discrete little sensors, tiny little electronic sensors that each recorded a little tiny portion of a picture and made it into a whole. And we'll look at that a little bit in another context. So that's another thing that I'll talk about here. So this is an overexposure. What this means essentially is that there's too much light reaching the sensor or the film, and it seems to look washed out. The bad part about this, and I may mention this more than once, obviously, is that there's no way to compensate for it, because when it gets, we call this blown out. In other words, once the media is blown out or overexposed, it basically cannot transmit any information, and there's not a whole lot you can do to bring this back down if this was the original photograph. So that's kind of the difficulty. Here's an underexposed photograph, the exact opposite. In other words, in this case, not enough light got to the sensor or the film to make an image. Fortunately, with a lot of digital tools in the digital world, underexposure is far less serious than overexposure. If you underexpose a photo, you can almost always, through software, third-party software, you can manipulate the image and gain back most of the information that was in the original image. However, on an overexposed image, the information is simply gone. It's not there. It was never recorded. And so there is no software that will bring back a highly or badly overexposed image. It will simply look like light still, no matter how you look at it. The thing about taking photos, and it's important here, is many of the photos, the cameras today have a way to instantly view the image. Just as soon as you take the image, you can look at it and see if it's okay. Well, the answer to solving most of those problems is to take advantage of that fact. And when you do take a picture with your digital camera, check it out before you get in a situation that you lose the opportunity to take the picture. So, for example, if you're taking a picture of a person, you might want to go back and take the person again, but if they've walked away, or if you've left or traveled or gone someplace, and then you may no longer have any access to that particular person or location or wherever it is that you are. So make sure that your pictures are being taken. I say that out of very personal experiences with the problem, because what happens to me occasionally is that my drive, my flash drive, or my micro SSD drive, solid state drive, will not have been put in the camera properly, and I can be taking a series of photos and I'm thinking I'm recording them and I'm not. And so I lose a whole segment of photos that I've taken or thought I've taken and have not taken. So there's a real reason for us periodically being very obsessive about making sure that once you've clicked that shutter, that the picture you have is being properly recorded in your camera. And most cameras will let you look back and go through the pictures so that you can see each one. Now, kind of from this point on in the presentation, I will make some very brief references to film, but I am not, from the reality is today is that most of the people will be taking pictures with a digital camera, almost exclusively, actually. There is a movement among photographers to go back to taking pictures with film. And once again, I would say if what you want to become is a photographer, and if that interests you, then that's something you might want to pursue. But on the other hand, if you're wanting to do this for genealogical purposes, for preserving family memories or preserving documents or whatever, then right now there's really no reason to to mess around with film. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and it certainly does not lend itself for sharing the images with other people. You only have one copy of an image. And if you make additional copies, then there's a problem with the degradation of the original copy of the images and things like that. So the reality of it is today is that almost exclusively digital imaging is going to become the way that we do photography. Now, focusing is an entirely different subject because it has nothing to do with the amount of light. You might have a perfectly good, balanced, wonderfully exposed picture, and it might be totally out of focus, like this one, and none of the details are visible. And there's another problem with this particular image that I picked out of the old pictures that I have around, and that is that the camera itself was defective and it was leaking light. Either the back of the camera was accidentally opened for a brief moment and thereby exposed the film, or the camera itself was defective, had some kind of leak of light, of crack in it or something, and leaked light in and got part of the photo completely overexposed and discolored. And so this part of the photo is where that's obviously bad. The whole photo, by the way, is out of focus. Now, what does it mean when it's in focus? Well, focusing the camera is a mechanical process of moving the position of the lens to where it creates a sharp image on the sensor or on the film. So it's a physical thing, and you actually have to either turn a knob. Most of the new cameras, by the way, any camera that you would be purchasing today, if you were just to go into one of the stores that sells cameras and just bought a camera, would have an automatic focus capability. It would be able to have a setting that when you push the button, the camera itself would focus on the particular subject. The problem with an autofocus camera is that you may end up focusing on the wrong subject, and so the one you're actually trying to take the picture of is out of focus. So that can also happen, and that's one of the hazards of relying too heavily on the equipment itself rather than using the information that you can supply by setting the camera properly for the photo. Camera movement is the difference between out of focus and camera movement is just sort of academic, because they both produce very fuzzy or in some cases completely undistinguishable pictures. You can't tell what's there because it's been moved too much. The camera itself is moved. You can tell that it has because it sometimes leaves a double slide off the side image. And if you were to zoom in on this particular photo, you would see that it was the results of having the camera out of focus, and not the lens was not improperly focused, but the camera itself was moved, and that's why the image is the way it is. There's actually a little bit of slide over on the images so that it took like the movement, like showing the movement of the camera. You get the same process, by the way, if the subject moves. So it's really not any different if the person were to move sideways or move across the camera focus, then you'd get the same problem. So either the camera or the movement of the person. So there are simple ways to avoid camera movement, and there are relatively not quite so simple ways to avoid improper exposures and things that are out of focus and badly composed pictures. So that's kind of what we'll talk about here as I go along. to avoid camera movement is fairly simple. If you're doing a lot of copying of documents or artifacts, you may want the structure on the right camera stand that has lights that are associated with the camera to give you an even light on the subject, and a upright pillar where the camera can be fastened and moved up and down to get the sharpest focus possible for the items that you're taking photos of. And this is a very good way to take photos. And then there's some other mechanical things that you need to know about to do this. As a matter of fact, my wife and I this past year spent a year in the year of 2018 at the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, Maryland, digitizing records for Family Search. And we spent that whole year in front of a little more elaborate camera stand than the one shown in the picture, and with a bigger bank of lights and a fixed camera up there that was set at the exact point that would take the sharpest pictures. And so we were taking a whole long series of photographs. But the process of what we were doing as we were taking those photographs was maintaining the paper, the book, or the individual documents so that they were in focus. And it was something that you had to work with on every single time you took a photo. So we had to worry about the focus just continually. Fortunately, the software was quite sophisticated and eliminated most of the problems, but not all. So we had to monitor every photo, as I've indicated previously, and look at everything that was photographed. In fact, we went back through after we took a series of photos and reviewed every single photo individually to make sure that the image had been captured properly. On the left is a tripod. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of different kinds of tripods out there, and some are very complex and some are not. But basically, they'll all do the same thing, and that is they're designed to hold the camera steadily so that there's no camera movement when the photos are taken. If you are taking pictures of a family or of relatives or whatever, it's probably a good idea, unless you are extremely familiar with your camera and have a steady hand, to use a tripod, to use some way of keeping the camera steady so that the photos are not showing camera movement or being out of focus. Now we're going to talk a little bit about composition. You can tell something about composition when you see a photo like this. It's important that you understand what you're looking at here. I'm guessing from this old photograph that this was somebody's farm or homestead, and that the idea here was to have a picture of the house, that was the main focus of the photograph. Basically, what you got here was a photograph that looked like the person was standing on the side of a hill and a little bit sloped. Generally, that's just the manner of not having the camera straight. But on the other hand, if the idea here was to take a picture of the house, then why is there this big tree and why all the other things? Perhaps it was to show the yard, but in any event, there's lots of things about this photo that are important to understand that we'd say are just a very poor example of composition. If the house was the main focus, then it would have been better had this person moved a few steps forward, taken the camera and set it on the fence and taken the picture of the house. Likely we would have had a much better picture of the housing structure of where these people lived than otherwise. If it was to show the whole farm, then perhaps he could have taken a few steps back and put the house into a context of where it was. and given us an idea of the size of the property. It would have been helpful also to move to the left a little bit in this photograph and get a little bit more of the front of the house. You'll see that the front of the house is pretty much in the shade, and so there's very few details right on the front of the house. So it might be helpful to move a little bit so that the front of the house is properly exposed and the house is visible. So there's quite a few things about this photo. Now the black things that are on the photo, those big black, that looks like bars or whatever on the corners, are the black film mounts. They're little gum stickers that they put on a photo album to hold the photos. Unfortunately, these particular ones had glue on the part that went on the film and cannot be removed without damaging or tearing the film or ruining the surface. So we get pictures of the bars along with our cameras. So there's a couple of points here. One is the proper preservation of the photograph once the photograph is made. If it's important and if it has any historical value at all, it certainly needs to be preserved properly and correctly, and that includes not sticking it down with glue or taping them down with various kinds of sticky tape, like the commonly used tapes that we have for offices and things like that. So there's lots of different ways to preserve that, but that's another whole different subject, and digital preservation is something that I've done some other presentations on. So here's another idea of composition. Very interesting picture, obviously having to do with something, either Mother's Day or some other tribute to mothers. Very nice picture. Once again, the picture is a little bit skewed so that it has a little bit of tension in it, because one child is kind of a fair distance above the border of the picture, and the other child has their toes cut off. A couple of them there in the line have their toes cut off. The people are not centered in any way, and there's kinds of things that would help that photo have been better. Although this is a much better photo than the one of the farm, because it does show all the girls and their faces are all visible. Obviously, we would like to know who these people are, and that is another one of the issues that comes up especially with older photographs, and that is to take the time to identify the people that are in the particular images that we take. Once again, I'm not a very good example personally of that, because I take a lot of photographs, and I don't always take the time to identify all the people in the photographs. But that is something that we can work on constantly, and it's helpful, though, to preserve the photographs. In this case, what I would suggest, one very good place to put your photographs is in the memories section of the FamilySearch.org website. And FamilySearch has a way to preserve those memory photos in perpetuity. So it'll be there for an awful long time, years and years and years in the future, and available to all the family members. And as you add the photos, then it's very simple to tag them or identify the people that are in the photos. So that really kind of solves two things. One is the preservation of the image, and secondly, the identification of the people or places that are in the images. So this is a little better composition here. Now we'll get to another couple of examples. The one on the left, we would call that a snapshot. It happens to be a photograph of my grandmother. And the problem we have here is that there's somebody's arm in the right-hand side of that photo. Kind of wondering who that person is. I mean, they will never know. We will never know. the other person standing behind. And so this kind of violates every possible idea of good composition. We should have had the photo taken with the people all who are supposedly important all together. Should have been back far enough or close enough that if the only thing that was wanted here was a picture of my grandmother, then perhaps she could have asked the people to step out of the picture. There's lots of things to do that make this a more could have made this a much better composition. Now on the right, what you have is a studio photo. This was a photo taken by a professional photographer, pretty obviously, of a what appears to be a graduating class from a school, and it's been composed and it's very well arranged, and it would be comparable to most of the formal photographs that people have made over the years using professional photographers. And the difference between the picture on the right and the picture on the left is the reason why people will actually go and pay to have their pictures taken. That's one of the major reasons that happens. And so when you hire a professional photographer to take pictures, you expect to get the thing on the right and not the thing on the left.
They don't look as happy though.
There's what Megan has made a little comment here, which I think is helpful, and that's that these people don't appear to be very happy. Well, part of the problem here is that the camera process with taking a photo was extremely tedious and extremely hard. And no one was very happy by the time they finally got a photograph. It was very interesting. And it was not customary in the photographs to smile. They weren't supposed to be happy. They were supposed to be serious, important events that were being recorded in. And they didn't want everybody looking frivolous and smiling. And so it was both a cultural issue and a physical limitation in the technology that would not let these people have their image taken quickly. If you've had your picture taken at a studio, if that's something that's in your background and that you've paid to have a studio photo, you'll know that the studio photographers today will take 50 or 100 pictures of you, and then they'll have you choose the ones you like. Well, in that day, there was nobody way in the world they were going to take more than one or two photos, because the cost of the photograph and the cost and the time and expense that it took to get it developed and processed was just prohibitive. So they basically got whatever there was. And I almost never see photos with people smiling in them that were taken in the early 1900s and the 1800s. I can date this photo, by the way. It's probably around 1915, somewhere between around 1915 to no later than 1920, and maybe as early as 1910. So it's a pretty old photo. So when we say, what is a good photograph and what are we trying to achieve, we look at it and we say, a good photograph has two main elements. It's mechanically correct. Okay, all of the mechanics of working the camera, taking the picture, the exposure, focus, lack of movement, all of those things are done, including the exposure and focus, and it has a good composition. Okay, so what we're looking at is something that conveys a message about the subject of the photograph. In the case of the one that we just looked at, the high school graduation picture, you really get a lot of information from that picture. There's the clothing they're wearing, the fact that they're all holding their diplomas, things like that, the flowers, all sorts of things that are in that photo that make it interesting and make it a historic moment and a genealogically valuable program, assuming you can identify the people that are sitting there in that photograph. And as a matter of fact, I could probably do that because I can guess where the photograph was taken. I know which school it was. I could look and see which graduating class corresponded, and I may be able to quickly determine who those people are, at least generally get a list of the names and have their relatives identify them. Now we're going to ask a question about the equipment. Is equipment important? And the answer to that is, to some extent, yes, and to some extent, no. I mentioned this earlier about people who fixate on the equipment and end up buying tremendous amounts and very expensive equipment to do a job. But there's a vast difference. So, for example, if you were to buy an inexpensive camera, by the way, none of the cameras in that photo are particularly inexpensive. If you were to buy an inexpensive camera and you were to go out to take photos in a very harsh environment, either very far north where it was very cold, or very far into a desert area where it was very dusty and extremely hot, you would find out that your little camera that you spent a few dollars on wasn't worth much after a few days of taking pictures, mainly because it was not built in a fashion that would exclude dust, and it was not built in a fashion that it would operate in extremely cold or extremely hot temperatures. And so one of the basic mechanical reasons why some cameras are very expensive is because they operate under a tremendous range of different conditions. There are cameras that will operate on the moon, and there are other cameras that wouldn't operate in a house for very long. So there's a big difference the way that they're done, and by and large, the cost or the amount of money spent on the camera and on the lenses relates to the durability and the ruggedness and all of the things that you would be concerned about were you hauling your camera around the world to take pictures. So that's kind of where the difference between the professional and the casual or novice or amateur photographer. An amateur photographer, by the way, amateur is a term that means that an enthusiast could very well appreciate the need for a very expensive camera. So just because someone doesn't choose to make money or try to sell or get an income from their photography does not mean that they are not superior photographers and use extremely good equipment. Where cameras differ dramatically is in the one part that is the most important, and that is in the lenses. The lens is the camera in a sense that it makes, it's where all the light has to go through to get to the sensor. Obviously, you need a sensor, you need film, or you need an electronic sensor, but you really are not going to get good photos with a camera with a poor lens. And so the lens system is much more important than the little box that attaches to it that we call the camera. And if you're going to spend, when photographers know that if you're going to spend money on cameras and equipment, that you should spend money on getting good lenses rather than worrying too much about the camera itself. So that's only one of the factors. But the question here is, we're going to move into another layer, and that is what's happening out there in the world with all these cameras, and particularly digital cameras, is they're associated with the concept of megapixel. Now, the idea of megapixels is the sensors, the electronic sensors, and each little individual sensor captures a certain portion of the image. And so you have all these sensors, and the more sensors there are, the higher resolution or the more detail that the camera will capture. And so what we've done is, as a culture and as part of the photographic community, is they've focused on the detail, the amount of detail in the photo, and they call that is measured in the number of little individual electronic elements called pixels that exist in the sensor of the camera. Now, why is that important? Well, film had a fairly, the sensing agent on a film is our what are called silver halide crystals, or other kinds of crystals that are sensitive to light. And so the various, those are very, very tiny. They're almost down to the atomic level in some instances. And so the resolution of some films is very, very high. That meaning that you can get a tremendous amount of detail out of it before the image breaks down through magnification. And when they began with digital cameras, the limitation was that the pixels were relatively large, and comparing a digital photo to a film image was a little bit ridiculous, because the digital photo had such large pixels that it went out of focus. It just lost detail almost immediately if you either enlarged the photo or you took a close look at the detail of the photo, magnified it in some way. And so the idea of increasing this or decreasing the size of the little sensors, or the pixels, and adding more and more pixels to the sensors was a way that the cameras could become more technologically competitive with film. But in another sense, they also were a way that they could compete with each other. So if someone came out like they did originally with a 2 megapixel camera, then someone else would come out with a 3 megapixel camera, and so forth. And now we are going well up into the dozens or hundreds of megapixels. And so that is where we get all of the information. There was a crossover point, and the crossover point, by the way, is at about 12 megapixels. What happened about 12 megapixels is that a 12 megapixel camera took images which were in many cases indistinguishable from a film image, even with a high resolution or high or very fine film. The pixel count just became high enough to be acceptable in most circumstances. And so it's not saying that the sensors have come to the position of completely replacing film, but they are certainly to the point where cameras are high enough resolution that they can take, digital cameras are at high enough resolution that they can take photographs which are for any practical purpose sufficiently detailed to replace any need for film. So when we're looking at a chart like this, what do we mean? Well, you can see some numbers here. One starts with 480, and then there's 576 and 720 and 1080. That's the number of, those are our representations of pixels. And the squares give you a concept of how, what resolution equivalent they were. In other words, how big the picture could be with the same amount of detail. So if you had a 480 megapixel, or excuse me, not 480, but 480 pixel camera, then that would the photograph would have to be that size of the small red square in order for it to have any detail. As you increase the number of pixels, you increase the size of the image that can be that can contain the same amount of detail or resolution. So megapixels in a more practical sense, the higher the megapixels, if they tell you it's a 24 megapixel camera or a 36 megapixel camera or whatever, what that means is basically you can get a larger and larger print or representation of the image at the same amount of resolution as a smaller print with a lower number of pixels. So it's a size issue, and the practical reality is that there are limitations in the human eye, and so that you cannot see any more detail, even if you were with your eye, because your eye will not resolve any detail. And they've really surpassed the point in a lot of cases of the ability of the eye to resolve any more detail. In other cases, there's no reason for the detail. For example, if you're taking a picture of a black and white piece of paper with type written on it, there's no reason for very high resolution, because you probably have, if you looked very closely at the types that was on there, even if it were produced by a typewriter or some other mechanical means, it would still be fuzzy. And you're not going to get any more detail than the original in any event. So this is kind of the idea here. So now I'm going to show a couple of photos here, and we'll see which one you think was taken by a camera that cost $3,000 plus, a professional camera, and one that was taken by a smartphone. So which of those two cameras was the smartphone, and which one was the $3,000 professional digital single lens reflex DSLR camera? Okay, we're not going to tell you. We'll get to that later. So what we've got now today is we have what's called the battle of the megapixels, and it's all about price. So here on this camera, these two cameras right here, we have a 3.1 megapixel camera that you can buy today on Amazon for $17.49. And unfortunately, it's worth that. May not even be worth that, actually, if you really want to know. Okay, but on the other hand, you could go over over the board here, and you could get that 150 megapixel phase one camera on the right there, without the lens, by the way, for $51,990. That's the actual price today online for that phase one camera. Okay, so where are you going to go? What's the address? Now, I've already given it away, because I started out by saying you can get a perfectly adequate camera for under $300, under $500, and usually around $300 actually. But you can buy a 50 megapixel camera for less than $1,500 today. And I'll tell you, a 50 megapixel camera is immensely more adequate than anybody who's just doing genealogy needs. And we'll just move on here. But you've got to remember, the best camera is the one you have when you need to take the photo. It doesn't matter. You need to take the photos with whatever you have available. And in the case of people today, it's almost always their smartphone. They've got a phone in their pocket that has this camera that is probably as adequate as anything that any genealogist ever needed. And so there's really no reason to go out here and start fussing around with those cameras. These are the basic parts. They're very simple. They have a lens that lets the light in. They have an aperture that opens or closes to let in more or less light. They have an electronic sensor, a viewfinder that either goes down and looks out through the lens or uses some other kind of system. They have what are called mirrorless cameras today that use a electronic system of imaging. There's a button that you take shutter release to take the photo, and then there's some kind of display about the information in the camera. And usually on the back of the cameras today, there is some kind of a screen, an LCD or other kind of optical screen that lets you actually see the photo that you're taking. So why do genealogists need to know any of this? The answer is yes. By the way, you actually will take better photos if you learn more about your camera and you learn about photography. If you took a short course in photography, you would come out being a much better photographer than you are if you don't have that kind of information. And likewise, then, the images that you take, whether they be cemeteries or farms or homesteads or pictures of the land or country where your people came from, or your relatives, or weddings, or whatever we're taking pictures of, those kinds of things will be better pictures than you would if you don't know any of this stuff. I mean, that's just things going to happen. Now, what if you want to reproduce it? Well, we have cameras versus scanners. And very simply, it's cameras are for people and artifacts, and scanners are primarily for documents and digitizing other photos, old photos, paper photos, or slides. And so these are the two differences. And you need about a 21 megapixel camera to equal the quality of a flatbed scanner. And how do I get there? Over the years, I just kept buying higher megapixel cameras, and I would take a picture with the camera, and I would scan the same thing with a scanner. And when I finally got my camera that had 21 plus megapixels, it was almost impossible to tell the difference between the scanned image and the photo image. So that's about where it splits, is at 21 megapixels. Now, you can do a lot of things after you take the photo. And there's a lot of programs out there, and they're very sophisticated, and I would say very expensive programs, and to manipulate photos. And many, many photos out there, but the ones that are the most commonly used are the Adobe products of Photoshop, Lightroom, and Photoshop Elements, which is the inexpensive version, not inexpensive in one sense, but cheaper version than the Photoshop and Lightroom. In fact, none of these programs are actually sold anymore. They're all subscription programs. So there's an annual fee from what's called the Creative Cloud from Adobe. Here's a before picture. This is what this was just taken straight out of an album. And then I spent some time with, in this case, Photoshop and Lightroom, the two programs. And there's the after picture. That's what it looked like when I got through with the picture. A little better composition, a lot more detail, looks a lot better. And here's what they look like side by side. So you can see what you can do. And I didn't spend any inordinate amount of time on these. I spent just a few minutes doing these. So when should you edit a photo? Whenever it bothers you enough to go out and learn how to do it. That's the answer to that. I mean, you're not going to, believe me, if there are two programs that are harder to learn than Photoshop and Lightroom, I don't know where they are. But there are quite a few photos programs out there that are easier to learn and will produce somewhat the same things. But anyone who really is serious about doing good photo editing is going to be using one of those programs or an equivalent program out there. Here's another instance. The one on the left was the before. It had big black marks on it and all sorts of different things that we call artifacts back in the photo. I took some time. I didn't spend all the time I needed to, but I got rid of a lot of the problems. And with more time, I could have made it so that you couldn't really tell that they were ever there. So it's not completely done, but it's not perfect. So here's some suggestions if you're going to try to use a camera to digitize. After spending a year in Annapolis digitizing records and having spent many, many years previous to that digitizing records, I can say that there's some very basic things that you need to do. So you can scan. I would suggest scanning documents and photos. That means buy a scanner, don't use a camera. Scan your documents, scan your photos with either a flatbed scanner or a dedicated photo scanner. And then use 12 to 21 megapixel cameras for photos. If you're going to go out and take pictures and you're going to spend your time taking your relatives, at least get a camera that's good enough to have some detail. And it runs from 12 to 21 megapixels. For information's sake, an iPhone camera on an Apple iPhone is about 12 megapixels. A 21 megapixel camera can be purchased for under $500. learn how to operate your camera and scanner. That just goes without saying. You really need to do is either sit down and read the manual when you get the book thing, go online to YouTube, look at videos, take a course, learn about some very basics. Then you'll do a lot better, and your images will be a lot more useful to you and to your posterity. Save your photos in TIFF or RAW format. I said this, and I got some strong disagreement on RAW. Camera RAW saves all the information from the camera. However, it's very limited, and there may not be programs that recognize a camera RAW image. TIFF is a lossless format and is the one preferred by most people who are trying to preserve photos. However, a JPEG image, which is the other possibility, is perfectly acceptable. The only difference is you cannot manipulate or edit that kind of a JPEG image without losing detail and losing information, whereas you can do that with a TIFF. Make any editing changes to copies, not originals. Never take an original photo and change it. Always keep your originals. Even if they're really bad and need to be edited, don't throw away your originals, because the technology may get better and you may be able to do a much better job of improving or editing the images. Plus the fact we like to keep the originals around as genealogists and historians. Always keep your original photos even after they're digitized. People ask me if they need to keep them. My answer is absolutely yes. To the extent that it's humanly possible, please keep your photos. Okay, we're going to show a couple and talk about what's a great photo, but I'm just going to mention a few things here. We're getting out of time here on this presentation. First of all, this photo is well posed, it is well exposed, and it shows the ambience. It shows what was happening, where this person was seating, and what was around at the time. And so there's a lot of details in this photo that are interesting. What makes this a great photo? This is a professional photo taken in a professional photo studio. And it's actually the same person. That's my grandmother, and this is also my grandmother and one of my uncles. So these are people that are, it's a very good photo, and it has context, it's well posed. Everything about it makes it a good photo. What's bad? Well, a little too much white space at the top. We don't need all that. Would have been nicer if we'd got more of the images instead of the wall and things like that. It could go into quite a bit of discussion about that. Now, here's another photo. This one's even better photo. Very well organized. Everybody's visible. They don't look happy. Obviously, that's a problem. This is my great-grandfather, and this is a professional photo, and it's actually got the name of the photographic studio at the bottom of the image there. But that's ideal, and that's about as good as you're going to get if you ever get a photo of your ancestors and things. This is a great photo, whether by anybody's criteria. It doesn't really matter where you are, what kind of photographer you were. You would classify this as being among the great photographs, and it's probably the best photograph. These photographs, by the way, were all taken by not all, but primarily taken by my great grandmother, who was a professional photographer. And this again is my grandmother, but this is a classic photo. It shows the person, it shows the interior. The lighting is dramatic. It's just a great photo. Okay, now which of the photos was with the $3,000 professional camera and which was the smartphone? Anybody want to vote? How many of you raise your hands? No, I can't see anybody out there. But anyway, the one on the right was taken with an iPhone. The one on the left was taken with a Canon camera. $3,000 Canon camera. Okay. Can you tell the difference? Which one looks better? They look the same. Okay. Thanks for watching. Usually I stop here, but I'm going to say one or two things and then we're going to end. This is one of my photos. How did I take this photo? I was standing up, braced against the side of a cog railway car going up the side of the mountain. The train was jerking back and forth and moving. And I took this out the window, handheld. I held my camera and took this picture out the window. Okay, so what I'm saying by doing that is that all of the everything else I ever told you about, as I've mentioned in this whole thing, only comes down to that one instant when you press the shutter. If you can hold the camera still and keep it in focus and make sure the light's correct, when you press that shutter, it doesn't matter if you're standing on your head or hanging from the side of a cliff, you will get a great picture. Thanks for watching.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation, James. We'll switch over to the closing slide. Our next webinar will be on the 12th. That's a Thursday at the regular time. We'll be hearing from Catherine Grant. She'll be talking about the Family Search Memories Gallery, specifically the features they have for those that use that program heavily. And then following that, on the 9th, after a holiday break, we will be hearing from Susan Hoffman, and she'll be speaking on naturalization. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube page and on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can email at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. Thank you so much, and we hope that you have a wonderful weekend.